The rain had stopped just an hour before I reached the driveway, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and oak leaves. I hadn't planned to be here. Not really. I'd told myself for weeks that I would ignore the invitation that never came, that I would stay tucked away in the small farmhouse miles from anywhere, where the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft bleating of the goats in the pasture. But something in me had shifted the moment I heard my brother's voice on the local radio, his deep, steady tone thanking the town for honoring the proud military lineage of the Carter family. His words clung to me like burrs even as I turned the dial. That phrase, proud military lineage, had once included me. Now it rolled from his mouth like I'd never been there at all. I parked down the street from my father's sprawling house where tonight's family dinner would be held. The same white columns, the same perfectly trimmed hedges, the same flagpole with the stars and stripes snapping in the wind. I could see silhouettes moving in the dining room through the parted curtains, shadows of people I'd once loved like my own heartbeat. I wasn't invited. I knew that. I'd been uninvited for over a decade, the kind of absence that was never spoken aloud, but enforced with icy precision. Still, my boots carried me forward, gravel crunching underfoot as I followed the smell of roast beef and the faint echo of laughter. Inside, the long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier, already set for 13. Not 14, not for me. The name cards were printed in gold script: Captain Michael Carter, Dr. Elaine Carter, Lytton Collier's David Brooks, each name a title, a badge of belonging. And then near the farthest end, almost hidden between a folded napkin and a water glass, I saw it. My name, just Evelyn, no rank. No acknowledgement. I took the empty seat, my fingers brushing the linen napkin. Conversations faltered for just a moment before picking back up, louder than before. My father didn't look at me, not when I passed him the butter, not when I asked how he'd been, not when I forced a smile across the table toward my niece. They didn't have to say it. The exclusion was in every sideways glance, in every question directed to the person beside me instead of me. The roast beef was tender, the wine expensive, the air thick with something far heavier than steam rising from the mashed potatoes. At one point, my cousin stood to make a toast to those who have served with distinction. Glasses clinked, eyes glistened. I lifted mine too, out of habit more than hope, but no one looked my way. The words "served with distinction" rolled over me like I was made of stone. It wasn't just that they'd taken me off the wall, the gallery of framed portraits in the living room that celebrated every Carter in uniform. It was that they'd replaced my photo with a painting of an eagle, as if patriotism itself could be a placeholder for the daughter they'd chosen to erase. When dessert came, my brother regaled the table with stories from his latest deployment. My father beamed, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that rare private way I remembered from my childhood. A way he had once looked at me. When the plates were cleared, I quietly excused myself, the hum of conversation barely pausing to acknowledge my exit. I slipped out into the damp night, the cool air hitting my lungs like a gasp I hadn't realized I'd been holding in. I didn't slam the door, I didn't shout or demand they see me. I walked down the steps and into the shadows of the street, each footstep falling into the quiet rhythm I'd carried for years. It's one thing to be forgotten by strangers. It's another to be erased by blood. And as I reached my car and gripped the steering wheel, I knew something had been set in motion tonight. Not because they had rejected me again, but because I had finally decided this was not where my story ended. The day everything shattered didn't begin with sirens or speeches or the kind of drumbeat that warns you the world is about to split down the middle. It began with dust, dust on the horizon, dust in my teeth, dust settling over a sunrise the color of a fresh bruise. We were 20 miles west of Aleppo, running an op the brief had called routine. No op that asks you to carry extra morphine and a spare tourniquet is routine, but the word looks good on paper, and paper was all command wanted to see. They gave it a name that sounded clean, Operation Lantern Field, the kind of name that made politicians feel safe, saying it out loud in classified rooms, as if syllables could bleach anything. I was mission lead. I had been mission lead more times than I bothered to count, trained to land where maps turned to rumors and move people who had learned to survive by becoming small. I knew how to listen for lies through a radio. I knew how to tell a man he wasn't going to die while I watched his blood soak the sand. And I knew, deep in the part of me I'd never once ignored, that our satellite imagery did not match what we were walking into. The file said weapons cache in a concrete schoolhouse converted to a forward operating hub by a militia that liked to drape piety over profit. The photo angles were tidy, the labels comfortable. North corridor, south stairwell. 2 guard posts, no non-combatants observed. I stared at those black and white shapes back in the staging tent and felt a cold tapping in my ribs, the way the fences leaned, the shallow footprint of a truck that never left a track that clean. The broken line of figures that weren't soldiers, too small, too irregular. On the ground, the vision sharpened. The school building was real enough. Chalk dust still ghosting the windows, a painted alphabet peeling along the entry hall. Desks stacked like barricades, a cartoon sun half scraped off by a blade or a hand that stopped when it heard footsteps coming. My second, Staff Sergeant Jonah West, moved on my left, breath clipped into the rhythm we all learned and never forgot. He glanced up the stairwell, then at me. He didn't need to speak. The air had that heaviness to it, the kind that presses you down, insists on a truth you haven't named yet. Hold perimeter, I whispered. 2 on the roof, 2 at the rear gate. West, you're with me. We slipped past a trophy case that still held a soccer ball under dusty glass. The hall narrowed, the light tilted. I caught the iron smell first, rust and old water, but beneath it, something sweeter. Rotted fruit, the way syrup turns when it's left too long in the sun. In a classroom to our right, crude cots were lined up beneath a banner, written in a language I didn't speak but understood anyway. This was no clean operating hub. This was staging of something for someone, shabby and cruel and temporary. The basement door had 3 locks and 1 hinge that hadn't been oiled in months. West passed me the bolt cutters. He had the kind of hands that could twist a coin into a new shape and then set it back on the table so no one noticed it was different. He pried in silence. I counted back 5 from a number that had once meant safety, then forgot what it was supposed to protect me from. The last lock gave with a small metallic sigh. I pushed the door and felt the dark breathe. The stairs were steep and slick where someone had spilled something viscous and never bothered to clean it. The light bulb was a hanging thing that shouldn't have worked, but it did, flickering hard, throwing shadows that cut the bodies in the room into pieces and put them back together wrong. Cages. The word landed in my throat and lodged there. Not cells, not pens, cages. Welded, mismatched, some with blue paint flaking like old scar, some raw wire still bright at the twists. Inside, children. At first my brain refused the information as if it were a puzzle with no edges. Then details rushed in like a flood. Bare feet, knotted hair, a boy with a scar in the shape of a comma above his eyebrow, a girl clutching a strip of fabric the color of limes, eyes that blinked at us like we were a story someone once told them to help them sleep. There were 43 in all, and if you're wondering how I know, it's because I counted twice, and then a third time in case grief had made me bad at math. Wes stepped forward, every movement gentle, like you have to move when a bird flies into your house and you want to coax it back out without breaking its wings. "Ma'am," he whispered, the word barely air. I lifted my radio. "Copper 1 to Copper 6, we have non-combatant miners on site. I say again, non-combatant miners, 40 plus. Request immediate exfil assets, medical priority, basement primary building. Static." Then the kind of clipped voice you learn to feel before you hear it. "Copper 1, maintain position." Repeat, "Maintain position, wait for green." My jaw clenched until I felt the nerve flare near my ear. I pressed the transmitter again. "Copper 6, you misunderstand. We don't have time to wait. I need wheels and I need eyes. We need to move them." Silence that wasn't silence. The hush of someone covering a microphone to speak to a person standing just out of sight. The sound of paper shifting, of decision turning into policy. Then, "Negative Copper 1. Hold, drone coverage has been redirected." "Stand by. Stand by." I looked at the cages, at the mouths, some dry, some wet with drool, at the smallest boy whose head tilted heavy against the bars as if it belonged to someone else. "Stand by." The phrase tasted like pennies. "West," I said quietly, marked the hinges. We moved like we were born to it, because we were. Born to the kind of work no one wants to know is necessary until it saves someone they love. We cut, we lifted, we steadied little feet that had forgotten how to run. When the first lock came off, the group nearest the door didn't rush us. They watched, eyes black and wide and older than anything. The littlest girl held out her hand, palm up, like she was showing me she had nothing to barter with but that hand. I keyed the radio again. "Copper 6, I'm initiating civilian extraction. We will need an ambulance transfer point at Grid Echo 3. I will not hold position. Be advised, external opposition possible, close range." The reply came back colder. "Copper 1, disobeying a direct order will result in..." "Copy your concerns," I said, and clicked the radio off. You'd think the decision would feel like a cliff. It didn't. It felt like stepping into a room where the lights finally worked. We split into 2 teams. West and I were extraction with 4. The rest formed a moving perimeter. We wrapped the smallest kids in whatever we could find. Old coats, blankets stiff with someone else's sweat. My own jacket shrugged off and tied around the shoulders of a boy whose bones seemed to rattle when he breathed. The older ones we instructed quickly. One hand on the person in front of you, eyes on the floor, no sound unless I tell you to make it. We moved. Up the stairs, through the hall, where the cartoon sun smiled like an accusation. In the courtyard, a shout, the first crack of sound from outside. Then the snap of a rifle shot that ricocheted off the staircase rail and bit into the corner of a chalkboard near my head. "Down!" I hissed, my hand on a girl's spine, feeling the bird flutter of her terror. West returned fire, 3 sharp answers that brought us a corridor of air. The south gate was chained. We had a man on it with bolt cutters, his hands sure, even as rounds thudded into the stucco around us, chewing chalk into the air like snow. I counted again. 31, 32, 33 through the threshold, a boy stumbling, another child lifting him up like he'd practiced saving people his whole life. Someone screamed. It wasn't a child, it was one of mine, hit in the shoulder. I turned, grabbed the back of his vest, dragged him behind a toppled filing cabinet, pressed my palm into the red fountain trying to sing its own anthem through his skin. "Stay with me, Reese," I breathed. He nodded once, eyes bright with the weird light of a man who hasn't decided whether the world still contains him. I shoved gauze into the hole, wrapped him tight, felt the hot bloom diminish under my hands. "Go," he grunted. "I'm not your slow leak." We went. The alley was narrow, a ribbon of shadow between the stucco walls. There was a door at the end that didn't match the others, a newer lock, a chain that had been cut and relinked. West reached it first, boot hitting steel with a finality I felt in my teeth. The chain gave. We spilled into the bright, harsh, sudden, full of sounds that didn't belong to us. A marker 2 blocks over, a moped misfiring, the high bark of a dog who had never learned fear because no one had taught it yet. The safe point was a mechanic's yard we'd mapped the night before. To civilians, it looked like rust and rot. To us, it looked like angles and cover and a gate wide enough for a small bus if you asked nicely and paid in favors. We put the children on the floor against the back wall, out of line of sight. Wes tore open a med kit and handed me a syringe. 2 are seizing, he said, and I nodded, already calculating dosages, body weight, the edge between help and harm. I thought of the radio and its litany of rules, of the contingency brief that had politely warned us about the risk of regional sensitivities, of the note handwritten in the margin by a liaison I had never met. Recommended posture, non-escalatory. I almost laughed. Non-escalatory, tell that to a cage. When the new voice came through, it used my rank, the way a person uses a last name at a dinner party to remind you that you belong to the wrong side of the table. Colonel Carter, you are out of compliance with operational command. Evac assets are not authorized. Do you copy? I lifted the transmitter, looked across the yard at a boy drinking water so slowly you'd think he was stealing each sip from an angry god. I copy, I said, and then I told my team to start. We flagged down 2 local vans we'd prearranged for materials transport. The drivers looked into the yard, saw what was not supposed to exist, and did not flinch. We loaded the smallest first, wrapped in jackets that still smelled like us, which was sweat and cordite and laundry soap from a base that would later pretend it didn't know our names. On the second run, a figure appeared in the yard's doorway, a man with a phone raised, filming. Wes moved to block the shot, palm out, not rough. No cameras, he said softly in English, and then in a handful of words, none fluent, all respectful. The man lowered the phone. He looked at me, then at the children, and lifted 2 fingers. A sign I'd seen in 100 languages, sometimes meaning peace, sometimes meaning I'm with you. He backed away. We made 3 trips. On the last one, the oldest girl, a teenager with a scar running through her eyebrow like a dash in a sentence, turned at the van's door and looked at me hard, as if memorizing my face might anchor her to a world that made no promises. I nodded at her. Not a smile, not the kind of expression people put on in movies to pretend horror is manageable. Just a nod that said, I see you. You are real. We pushed the van doors closed and slapped the sheet metal twice, a signal older than any radio, and the vehicles rolled. My chest loosened only when I watched the last set of taillights disappear into the fretwork of traffic. The yard went quiet, except for the steady aluminum hum of heat coming off the roof. My radio hissed again, words parceling out blame with bureaucratic polish. Colonel Carter, you will return to staging and await formal debriefing. Do not engage further. We went back anyway, because Reese had to be moved and because I needed to see the basement empty with my own eyes. The school was a swarm of echoes now, the militia fallen back or repositioning to a place where we couldn't see them, but they could see us. I stepped through the door and down the stairs, my boots slipping once on the same slick patch I'd marked with my heel going down. The cages were open mouths. The air was cooler by a degree that felt theological. I stood there like a woman who'd come to watch a miracle try to convince itself it had happened. Outside, West limped in, his ankle rolled. face set in that stubborn way he had when Payne tried to bargain with him and lost. He tipped his head toward the light. "We should go, ma'am," I nodded. "We exfilled by a route no one would have picked if they wanted to write a clean report. We carried Reese between us for a stretch. Then he walked himself because he hated being carried, and I loved him for it. When we reached the handoff, a medic I'd never seen before took his vitals and did not ask me why the paperwork would never say what we'd done. He just said, 'He's good,' and we both knew that meant alive." In the debrief, the fluorescent lights stuttered overhead like they always did, like truth does when it knows it's about to be told to sit down. A man in a shirt without a nameplate asked me to walk through my decisions in language that sounded like ethics, but felt like procedure. I said the words I had to say. I left out the smells. I left out the way the teenager's eyes had landed on me like an oath. I did not apologize. When they told me the mission would be reclassified, I did not protest. When they handed me the non-disclosure agreement, I read it like a prayer I didn't believe in and signed. Afterward, in the dim hallway outside the briefing room, Wes leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. "We did the only thing," he said. "Yeah," I answered. "And that won't be the story they tell?" He nodded like he'd always known it would end this way. We split at the stairwell. He went left. I went right. I washed the dust off my hands in a sink that didn't drain properly, watched the water swirl and hesitate before it disappeared. You can call it a metaphor if you want. I just call it a memory. I didn't sleep that night. The truth has a hum. And if you've ever stood under a power line in the dark, you know the sound I mean. In the morning, I folded my uniform like I always did, precise, corners squared, service patch smoothed with the edge of my thumb, and I felt the fault line running through it. Not a tear, a line, a new shape the fabric would have to learn. The day everything shattered didn't give me time to choose whether I wanted to be a hero or a problem. It asked me one question: do you move? I moved, and no matter what they wrote, I would answer the same way again and again until I ran out of breath. You grow up in the Carter family, you learn early that service isn't a choice, it's an inheritance. We weren't just a military family, we were a military institution. Our lineage was displayed like a trophy case that spanned decades. Black and white portraits of my grandfather in his army greens, my uncles in Desert Storm fatigues, my brother Michael in his crisp West Point uniform, beaming like a Kennedy. And once there had been me. My photo was taken the day I received my first commission, hair tucked neatly under my cap, jaw tight with purpose, eyes fixed forward. That picture hung just to the right of my brother's, slightly lower, of course, because, as my father liked to joke, rank goes left to right, oldest to youngest. For years, I stood proudly on that wall. The wall itself was the beating heart of the Carter home. Every family gathering passed through that hallway, kids ran beneath it, parents paused to straighten frames, and my father, Richard Carter, lingered there like a priest tending to his altar. I'd seen him stand before those portraits in his robe with a cup of black coffee, staring as though the faces might speak to him. If you were on that wall, you mattered. If you weren't, you didn't. And then, one day after Syria, my portrait was gone. No warning, no ceremony. Just replaced overnight by a watercolor of a bald eagle, the kind you'd find in a second-hand shop. Subtle enough to be ignored, deliberate enough to cut. I never asked my father why. I didn't have to. His silence was the same as a verdict. The official record said I had disobeyed a direct order, jeopardized an operation, compromised an alliance. In the Carter codebook, there was no heavier sin than breaking the chain of command. My father was the codebook. He'd served 32 years in the army, retiring as a decorated colonel. He believed in rules the way some men believe in God. His love was a rare currency awarded for discipline, obedience, and an unshakable loyalty to the system. As children, my brother and I learned early, follow the chain, don't question the order, and above all, never make the army look bad. Michael, my younger brother by 4 years, understood how to play the game. He was charismatic where I was blunt, smooth where I was stubborn. He could win over a room before he'd even taken off his coat. He climbed ranks with the kind of ease that made other officers resent him quietly and salute him publicly. And when my career detonated, he was right there to slide into the vacancy I left behind. We never spoke about it, not once. He never asked me what had happened in Aleppo, never pulled me aside to hear my side. If anything, I think he liked the new family order. His name was spoken louder, his picture hung higher. I remember one dinner, months after my discharge, when my father hosted a celebration for Michael's promotion to major. The house was full, cousins, aunts, old army buddies. My father made a toast, calling my brother the embodiment of Carter honor. I was standing just a few feet away, holding an empty glass, pretending to admire the fireplace. My name never crossed his lips. Michael caught my eye once that night, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression, but instead of walking over, he turned back to the group and poured himself another drink. That was Michael, always knowing where the wind was blowing and never standing in its way. And then there was my mother, Grace, the softest part of the Carter machine. She'd grown up the daughter of a Navy man, so she understood the weight of the uniform, but she also understood the weight of silence. She was the one who used to slip letters into my deployment bag, small notes reminding me to eat, to sleep, to breathe. After Syria, she didn't stop loving me, but she did stop fighting for me. She'd call sometimes, ask how I was, then quickly change the subject if I drifted too close to the truth. "You know your father?" she'd say, as though that explained everything, and maybe it did. The rest of the family followed suit. At holidays, conversations were carefully steered away from anything in camouflage. I was given the far end of the table, away from the cluster of uniforms. My name cards at family events lost their titles. No more Colonel Evelyn Carter, just Evelyn, written smaller than everyone else's. They called it civility. I called it exile. By the time the annual Carter Military Legacy Reunion rolled around each year, I wasn't even a footnote in the program, but I still checked the flyers, the schedules, the lists of honorees. Somewhere deep down, I wanted to know if maybe, just maybe, they'd put me back. They never did. Instead, there was a quiet clause at the bottom of the invitation page. Due to the formal nature of this event, we kindly ask that guests refrain from inviting individuals whose service has been subject to disciplinary action. They might as well have put my name in bold. The Carters believed in honor the way some families believe in inheritance. But what they called honor wasn't built on truth. It was built on a spotless image, a wall without cracks, a lineage without scandal. And in their eyes, I had put a crack in the marble. What they never understood, what they didn't want to understand, was that I hadn't destroyed our family's honor. I had preserved it in the only way that mattered. But they weren't ready to hear that. Not yet. There's a strange thing that happens when you hit rock bottom. At first, you think you're still falling. The air feels the same, thin and cold, and you keep bracing for the next drop. But then you realize, this is it. You're already on the ground. The only thing left is the echo of the fall. After Syria, the army didn't court-martial me. That would have been too loud, too public. Instead, they pulled me from the field, reassigned me twice, then made the silence so suffocating that I finally resigned. No public disgrace, no headlines, just a slow erasure, the kind where one day your badge doesn't work at the gate and nobody looks you in the eye as you walk out. My pension was reduced. My medical benefits got tangled in pending review limbo. I had no spouse, no children, and no reason to believe anyone would fight for me. And when I looked for work, civilian security firms, disaster response teams, even private investigation agencies, the background checks were always inconclusive. The polite way of saying, we saw the red mark on your record and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. That was the professional loss. The personal one cut deeper. After my resignation, I moved into a small rental cabin 2 hours from the nearest city. It had no internet, a wood stove for heat, and a front porch that faced a field of stubborn grass and wild thistle. I told myself it was what I wanted: peace, quiet, an escape from the noise. But really, it was exile disguised as choice. The phone barely rang except for the occasional wrong number. When it did ring with a familiar voice, my mother, or once in a blue moon, my cousin Leah, the conversations were light, surface level. They'd ask about the weather, the goats I'd started keeping, the vegetables in my garden. No one ever asked about the army. It was as if those 33 years had been carved out of me and buried somewhere no one dared visit. I learned to measure my days in small victories, splitting enough wood to last the week, fixing a leak in the roof before the rain, coaxing a stubborn goat back into the pen without cursing out loud. I tried reading, but my mind would drift back to things I couldn't talk about. I tried running, but every footfall echoed with memories of Aleppo. The stairwell, the smell, the way one boy's hand had gripped mine like it was the only thing holding him to the earth. Loneliness doesn't arrive all at once. It's a slow drip, like a faucet you can't quite turn off. The worst part wasn't the isolation, it was the invisibility. When I went into town for supplies, people didn't recognize me, not as a soldier. Not even as a carter. I was just some quiet woman buying feed, blending into the background of a place that didn't care who I used to be. There were nights I didn't speak a single word, not even to myself. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee gone and cold, staring at the tree line, listening for something, anything, to remind me I was still part of the world. Some nights I'd hear distant rotors, the kind of sound that makes you think help is coming. It never was. I told myself I didn't care what the Carters thought anymore, but that was a lie. It wasn't their approval I wanted, it was the acknowledgement that I existed, that I hadn't just vanished from the family ledger like a misprint, that the 43 children from Aleppo were worth the stain on the Carter name. The worst moment came 2 years after I left the army. My father updated the family's military lineage plaque, the brass board that hung in his study listing every Carter who had served. My name had been engraved there once between my brother's and my cousin Roy's. I found out through Leah, who slipped up in a phone call saying, "It looks cleaner now." Cleaner. I knew then I'd been cut from the plaque, just like I'd been cut from the wall. My space replaced with a blank brass plate that read, "Reserved for future service." As if I'd died, and they were saving my spot for someone more worthy. That night, I sat on my porch with a kind of stillness that feels like stone. I thought about driving into town, finding the nearest bar, and telling the first stranger I met everything, the mission, the kids, the silence. But I didn't, because I'd learned the hard way. When people have already decided you're guilty, the truth sounds like an excuse. Rock bottom isn't just a place, it's a season, and mine stretched on year after year until I couldn't remember what the air felt like at any other altitude. Then one morning, a storm blew in so hard it rattled the windows in their frames. The power went out and I lit a single candle. Its light flickered across the box I kept under my bed, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside was my folded dress uniform, my service patch, and a handful of medals I'd never worn in public. I stared at them until the candle burned low, wondering if they were proof I'd lived a life worth something, or just relics from a story no one wanted to hear. That's when I realized something. I wasn't done. I didn't know what not done looked like yet, but I knew it didn't look like dying in a cabin that no one would come looking for. I might have been invisible to them, but I wasn't gone, not yet. They say some things in You Never Die, even when you bury them deep. For me, it was the habit of waking before dawn, moving through the dark without a sound, scanning every shadow for movement. I'd told myself that was over, that I'd left the mission-driven part of my life behind, but habits have a way of waiting for you. It started with a letter, not the kind that arrives in a crisp government envelope with a seal and a warning. This was plain, folded twice, slipped under my cabin door while I was in town. No return address, no signature, just 5 words written in block capitals. They're asking about Syria, again. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter between my hands, the wood grain beneath it sharp as a map I couldn't read. They could mean a lot of things. Journalists, old contacts, people who still had the clearance to dig where they weren't supposed to. Again meant something was stirring, and that, more than anything, meant my quiet life was about to end. The first time I'd been asked about Syria, I'd lied, not to protect myself, but to protect the children we pulled out of that basement. I told the official version, an incomplete evac, mission compromised, no comment on civilians, and then I signed a piece of paper saying I'd never speak of it again. But a decade is a long time for secrets to stay buried. People retire, files get mishandled, and somewhere, somehow, a thread had been pulled. That night, I sat in the glow of a single lamp and thought about all the ways I'd been erased. The missing photo, the blank plate on the lineage board, the fact that my name was never spoken in rooms that once rang with it. I thought about the boy in Aleppo who had clung to my jacket, and the teenager with the scar who had looked at me like she was memorizing my face. If the truth came out now, I wouldn't just be defending myself, I'd be defending them. The goats were restless in their pen, shifting in the dark. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside, the air sharp enough to taste. The sky was heavy with stars, the kind you only see when you're far from city lights. Out here, it was easy to pretend the world was simple, but I knew better. I'd lived too long in the shadows where politics and orders collide, where truth isn't decided by what happened, but by who writes the report. The letter didn't ask me to act, but it woke something in me. Over the next few weeks, I started running again. 5 miles every morning, then 10. I dug my old rucksack out of the closet and loaded it with weights, testing my endurance on the trails that wound through the hills. My body remembered the work even if my knees didn't thank me for it. I also began making calls. Not to family, they weren't my allies. I called people who owed me favors, people who had been there on nights when no one else would answer. Most didn't pick up. Some did, their voices cautious, their loyalty buried under years of distance. "Eve," one old teammate finally said after a long pause, "what are you planning?" "I'm not sure yet," I told him, "but I think I'm done hiding." The transformation wasn't sudden. It came in layers, physical, mental, emotional. I shaved my hair shorter, sharper, not for vanity, but for practicality. I replaced the old wood stove in my cabin with a generator that could run silently for days. I set up a lockbox in town under a false name, stocked with cash and a burner phone. It wasn't paranoia, it was readiness. And somewhere in the middle of all this, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my uniform for the first time in years. It still fit, though the shoulders were tighter, the fabric stiffer. The medals lay in a neat row on the table beside me. I didn't pin them on. They weren't why I was doing this. The truth was, I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for, but the feeling in my gut, the same one that had told me to move in Aleppo, was back. And I'd learned long ago, when that feeling comes, you listen. Then, as if on cue, the formal announcement for the upcoming Carter Military Legacy reunion appeared online. My brother's face beamed from the event banner. My father's name was printed in the introduction, and at the bottom, in small italic letters, the same clause that had been there for years. Guests whose service has been subject to disciplinary action will not be admitted. It was aimed at me, always had been. I stared at the screen for a long time, and then I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I finally saw it for what it was, a challenge. If they didn't want me there, I'd show up anyway, not to cause a scene, not to beg for a seat at their table. I'd show up to remind them that erasing someone's name doesn't erase the truth. The plan began to take shape in my head. Precise, methodical, like every operation I'd ever led. I knew how to get in without being seen. I knew how to be close enough to watch without being caught. And if the moment came to speak, I'd be ready. I didn't know yet that the moment would come from someone else entirely. I arrived before the sun made up its mind. Dawn was still a rumor over Fairview, the town that nursed our family myths, the town that hosted the Carter Military Legacy reunion every year at Veterans Green. I parked 2 blocks away behind a shuttered bakery and sat with the engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the slow drum of my own pulse. The banner on the event page had called it a celebration of service. The small italic clause at the bottom had called it something else. I read both lines again in my head, then slipped on a plain navy shirt and a windbreaker without a logo, the closest thing I owned to invisibility. I didn't come to be seen, I came to see. On the passenger seat, my preparation was folded into quiet objects: a cheap ball cap, a pair of reading glasses that weren't prescription but changed the lines of my face, a compact umbrella in case I needed a screen, and a small envelope that held a letter printed on Department of the Army letterhead. Temporary partial declassification authorized for a 45-minute window. On-site review only. No reproduction permitted. No external recording devices sanctioned. The request had taken weeks, 4 calls that went nowhere, and 1 quiet conversation with a compliance officer who remembered me from a continent away and said, after a long breath, "Colonel Carter, I can't fix what happened. I can only stop pretending it didn't." He found a way for the truth to breathe without being caged. 45 minutes, short enough to be survivable for the people who hate sunlight, long enough for a man to change his mind. I slid the envelope into my inside pocket and stepped out. The morning air carried the clean metal smell of flagpoles and folding chairs, aluminum and promise. Volunteers in matching shirts rolled out a small stage, taped wires to the grass, tested the speaker with a crisp check, check. The town's marching band would tune later. The mayor would practice the joke he always told about our family and discipline. None of that was here yet. What was here was the geometry. I walked the perimeter like I always do, mapping the field the way a chess player maps a board. Not squares, but angles, not obstacles, but choices. Veterans Green is a square of lawn hemmed by low stone ledges and a chain-link fence waist-high on one side where the sidewalk meets the grass. An oak tree anchors the northwest corner, A maintenance shed hides behind trimmed hedges near the restrooms. The main entry is a wide gravel path where a volunteer with a clipboard checks names and smiles as if gatekeeping were hospitality. I counted exits, shadow lines, the places where a person can stand and be both present and ignored. I picked the fence. At 7:18 a.m., a white van arrived with rental chairs and a man who grunted like the wait was an argument he kept losing. At 7:43, two cousins I hadn't seen in years walked along the path, both in pressed navy blazers, one already pinning a tiny flag to his lapel. At 8:02, the first uniform cut through the morning. An army dress blue that didn't belong to the town's color guard. The wearer moved with the looseness of someone who didn't need to prove anything. He glanced at the sky, and for a beat I thought he saw me. He didn't. People never look at fences unless they want something on the other side. By 8:30, the crowd thickened. The event start time on the program was 9 in Okisaikas, but carters show up early the way fishermen show up for dawn, with ritual and the quiet vanity of being first. I recognized the shape of my father long before I recognized his face. Shoulders square, chin lifted, hands clasped behind his back to keep from fidgeting. He took the front row seat reserved with his name on a card and pretended not to need the chair at all. Beside him, Michael hovered, laughing with someone in a Marine Corps tie, rehearsing an expression I knew too well, humble, honored, flawless. I stayed where the chain link touched the stone ledge, one knee up, hands folded, a woman passing time. I had a program in my lap, picked up from a stack at the edge of the green, and I let my eyes track the order of speakers. There was a brief invocation, the pledge, a reading of the Carter Roll of Honor, a few medal presentations, and finally a keynote from my brother. My name was nowhere again. I looked for the italic clause at the bottom. It was there, polite and pointed as ever. The declassification window was set to open at 9:15. My contact had been very specific. Colonel, once it starts, I can only keep that door open for 45 minutes. After that, it's shut like it never existed. And I need you to understand, authorization isn't invitation. I understood him. I wasn't here to demand anyone's microphone. I was here to be undeniable, even in silence. At 8:56, I felt the old rhythm crawl back into my bloodstream, a metronome I didn't set and couldn't ignore. It's what we used to call the minute 30, the span before a mission hardens into real life. Everything goes quieter. Everything gets bright at the edges. I watched kids wave flags that were too big for their wrists. I watched a volunteer trace a cable with her fingers to make sure no one tripped. I watched the band director raise his hands, and with the first note, the green became a stage. I pulled the envelope out and ran my thumb along the crease. I could have walked to the gate and shown it to the volunteer, asked to be let in, claimed a seat at the back like I had asked for years ago. They would have read the words, paged an organizer, made calls. They might have let me stand along the side with polite smiles and cameras turned away. But that was still asking, still stepping into a room someone else controlled. I put the envelope back. I would wait. The invocation was brief and muscular, the kind men like my father appreciate: God, sacrifice, duty, amen. The pledge rose like a wave and fell the same way. Then the roll call began. Names were read with care, some too eagerly, as if honor were a raffle, and saying the name louder increased your odds. They read my grandfather, my uncles, my brother twice, once for his service, once for something called community heritage outreach. They read cousins, in-laws, a distant relative who once fixed radios in a stateside unit and never left Kansas. I could have mapped the omissions with my eyes closed. Erasures has a shape. That was the moment I prepared for. the tightness in my chest, the reflex to leave, to spare myself the old humiliation reheated. Instead, I breathed slow and put my hands on the cool metal of the fence. There's a trick for keeping your heartbeat calm under fire. You name 5 things you can feel, 4 you can see, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. The fence counted as 2, cold and rough. I could see the hem of the flag, the shine on my father's shoes, a little boy's cowlick, the small chip in the podium's edge. I could hear a leaf blower far away, a sparrow under the oak, a microphone crackle like static trying to become language. I could smell cut grass and the faint clean burn of fresh coffee. I could taste the metallic echo of waiting. The naming worked. The world stayed steady. At 9:14, a volunteer hustled from the parking lot with a radio at his shoulder. He whispered to the stage manager, who blinked and checked his phone. My father turned slightly, as if feeling a breeze others missed. My brother took his place behind the podium and set both hands on it like he was about to lift it. The stage manager tapped the microphone. "We'll have a brief pause," he said, trying to sound in control and only partially succeeding. I checked the time again. The window would open in 60 seconds. I didn't pray. I don't bargain. But I made a promise to myself in that sliver of second. No matter what happened next, I would not let them tell me who I was without contest. If nothing came, no signal, no acknowledgement, no proof, I would carry the 45-minute authorization like a pocket-sized sunrise and walk away knowing I had tried the door and found it locked from the inside. If something came, I would not run. I had done enough running to last 10 lives. 9:15. The phone in my pocket buzzed once. An unknown number, a single text with a single word, live. Not a command, a status. The window was open. I stood, not to climb the fence, not to make a scene. I stood because when truth is allowed to breathe, you face it on your feet. The music cut. The band faltered into silence like a train easing into the last station. Somewhere behind the hedges, an engine coughed. People muttered. I didn't turn my head. I knew the sound too well to mistake it for anything else. Not police, not parade floats, not the town's maintenance trucks. Military. Diesels tuned to a discipline that feels like a low earth tremor. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not for me. I had asked for paper, a permission that would live and die in the fine print. I had not asked for a spectacle. The message had said nothing about company. But the first rule of operations applies to life too. No plan survives contact with the truth. On stage, my brother leaned into the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, He stopped, eyes narrowing toward the street. My father did not move. He'd been taught to hold still when the ground shifts, and he taught that lesson to us whether or not we wanted it. The gravel path quivered. Heads turned. A teenage girl near the front shaded her eyes and said, "Is that?" The band director lowered his hands. A baby laughed, not understanding the way air can change when power enters it. A gust lifted the flag and snapped it straight out like the fabric had decided it would be a blade. This is the part where most stories jump ahead to the roar. But the sound I remember first was a breath. The collective inhale of a crowd that senses a page about to turn. I could have stepped forward then. I could have shouted. I could have raised my hand and made the moment about me. Instead, I closed my fingers around the fence and let the wave roll toward us. Whatever it carried, I had already decided I would not flinch. From my pocket, the envelope pressed faintly against my ribs, the letter inside like a heartbeat, not my own. 45 minutes? An accident of bureaucracy or an act of conscience, it hardly mattered now. The truth had a window, and the window was open, and I stood in the frame. Across the lawn, my father finally moved. Not much, just a small adjustment of his jaw, the kind you make when the old story no longer fits the teeth you've been grinding for years. He didn't look at me. Not yet. He looked at the path, at whatever was turning the air dense and bright. "Hold," I whispered. A word I had said 1,000 times to men and women who trusted me with their breath. It wasn't for them now, it was for me. A hum built underfoot. A line of dust rose at the far corner where Maple Street turns toward the green. I could see shapes now, angular, boxy, familiar as the bones in my hand. I let myself exhale, slow and controlled, and the exhale carried a memory with it. A basement that smelled like rust and syrup, 43 pairs of eyes, and a decision that refused to apologize for existing. I didn't know who had orchestrated what was about to enter the square. I didn't know whether gratitude or theater or justice or some messy necessary combination had opened the gate. I only knew this. I had returned in secret to watch a ceremony that had written me out, and the silence I carried was no longer empty. It was charged. The first vehicle cleared the corner. Conversation collapsed into the kind of hush that makes cameras forget how to blink. I raised my chin, not in defiance, but in recognition. It wasn't the convoy that changed me. It was the decision to stand unseen at the edge of a world that thought it had finished my sentence and refused to leave the last word to anyone else. The first Humvee rolled into view like a memory made of steel, matte green, angular, its engine low and deliberate. Behind it came another, then another, until 20 of them curved down Maple Street in perfect formation. No sirens, no music, just the steady grind of tactical diesel, each gear change as clean as a knife through cloth. Dust kicked up from their tires and hung in the morning air, softening the edges of the green like a stage curtain before the reveal. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. At first, a few people clapped, thinking maybe it was a planned salute to veterans. But the clapping faltered when they saw there were no flags mounted on the sides, no banners announcing the unit, no smiling waves from the drivers. These men and women weren't here for ceremony. They were here for something else entirely. My father stood now, posture perfect, his hand tightening on the back of his chair. My brother squinted against the light, one hand shading his eyes as if trying to read the convoy's intent in its approach. On stage, the mayor glanced nervously at the event coordinator, who gave a helpless shrug. This wasn't on the program. The Humvees formed a wide arc around the green, their tires flattening the grass, enclosing the field in a ring of silence and presence. Doors opened in sync. 200 soldiers stepped out, rows of 10, boots hitting the ground with that heavy, unified thud that makes your chest feel smaller. They fanned out into 2 parallel lines facing each other, creating a corridor right through the center of the event space. And then from the final Humvee, a black SUV emerged, slipping into the space between the soldiers like an ink stroke on a blank page. Its engine cut off, and for a heartbeat the only sound was the wind pulling at the flags overhead. The back door opened. Out stepped General Malcolm Rhodes. I hadn't seen him in 15 years, not since the day he signed the paper that sealed my record and told me, in words that felt like gravel in my mouth, "Take the fall, Carter, you'll survive it." He was older now, hair more silver than black, lines deeper around the eyes, but his presence hadn't dimmed. He wore his 4 stars with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. He didn't look left or right as he walked. He didn't stop to shake hands or nod to the dignitaries in the front row. He passed my father without so much as a glance. He passed my brother, who froze mid-step, his hand still on the podium. Rhodes walked straight toward the chain-link fence where I stood, hands folded, my face unreadable. When he stopped, 3 feet in front of me, the world contracted. He raised his right hand in a sharp, clean salute. "Welcome back, General Evelyn Carter." The words cut through the air like a bell, each syllable ringing against the silence that had held me hostage for over a decade. I didn't move. Behind him, the soldiers followed suit, every single one raising their hand in unison, a wave of silent respect flowing down the corridor they had formed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I could hear someone whisper, "Did he say General?" Another voice, "I thought she was..." And then nothing. My father's eyes were locked on me now, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. My brother's face had gone pale, the microphone still in his hand but forgotten. Rhodes dropped his salute but didn't step back. "I've requested your full honors be reinstated," he said, voice steady but carrying weight. "Temporarily declassified, effective now." The phrase landed in me like a slow strike of thunder. It wasn't just the reinstatement, it was the fact that he had chosen this place, this moment, to do it. Then, without waiting for a response, he turned toward the crowd and spoke loud enough for every corner of the green to hear. "For those unaware, this woman served 33 years in the United States Army. She led classified operations in 5 countries. She saved lives in places we are not allowed to name. She held rank when others held fear, and when the system failed, she held the line." A hum started at the back of the crowd, low at first, then rising as people began to understand. Phones were up now, recording every second. Rhodes faced me again. "We forgot to say thank you." Until now. Behind him, the soldier's salute held steady, a wall of stillness that made the air feel heavier. I didn't return the salute, not yet. My hands stayed at my sides, my breathing even. I wasn't frozen. I was measuring, not the moment, but the cost. I had lived 15 years without their acknowledgement, without my rank, without a place at their table. This wasn't about needing it back. It was about deciding what to do with it now that it had been forced into my hands. From somewhere in the crowd, I heard a child's voice, high and clear. "Is that her?" No one answered. Maybe no one knew what the right answer was. Rhodes took a step back, not retreating, but making space. "You can walk away, Carter," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "Or you can walk through that gate and show them who you are." The fence beside me clicked. Someone had unlocked it. I stepped forward. The soldiers shifted slightly, opening their ranks to form a path. My boots hit the grass with the slow, deliberate weight of someone reclaiming territory inch by inch. The crowd parted as I walked, heads turning, whispers swelling into murmurs, then falling silent again. I didn't look at my father. Not yet. I didn't look at my brother. I kept my eyes forward until I reached the center of the green, standing under the shadow of the flag. The air was different here, charged, waiting. Rhodes joined me, his voice low but certain. "You've got 40 minutes left." 40 minutes. The clock was ticking. And I had no idea that in less than 5 of them, the truth would walk out of the past and into this field, carried on the voice of someone I had saved without even knowing his name. It began quietly. No fanfare, no command barked over a microphone, just a subtle shift in the air, the way a room changes when someone walks in who doesn't belong and yet fits exactly where they are. I saw him before anyone else did. Tall, lean, mid-20s, wearing a grey suit that had seen better days. His shoes were dusty, not with the kind of dust you get from a parking lot, but the dry, clinging kind you pick up from walking on old asphalt under a hot sun. His hair was neat, his posture careful, like every move was measured against the weight of the moment. And then I saw it, the faint pale scar shaped like a comma just above his left eyebrow. I knew that scar. He made his way through the parted crowd with an odd combination of determination and hesitation, like he was afraid someone might stop him, but more afraid they wouldn't. In his hand, folded in half, was a single sheet of paper. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until he was 5 feet away. A volunteer tried to intercept him, murmuring something about the program schedule, but he shook his head just once with a quiet finality. He reached the edge of the small stage area and looked at the MC. There was a long pause, a kind of unspoken negotiation between the two of them. Then the MC, God bless him for whatever instinct overrode protocol, held out the microphone. The young man stepped up and turned to face the crowd. "My name is Dr. Aaron Khalil," he began, his voice steady but carrying the tremor of someone balancing on the knife's edge between composure and emotion. "I was born in Aleppo, Syria, and when I was 5 years old, I was taken from my village and used as a human shield by the men who did not care whether I lived or died." The words fell over the green like a shadow. Conversations died mid-breath. Somewhere near the back, I heard someone's intake of air, sharp, startled. "On February 16th, 2010, he continued, an American unit breached a compound outside Aleppo. They were ordered to wait. They were told it was too dangerous to proceed. But one woman, one commander, chose to move anyway. That woman was General Evelyn Carter." Every head turned toward me. I didn't move, couldn't. "My memories of that night are scattered," he said, his voice tightening. "Light, dust, the sound of boots on stairs, a woman kneeling in front of me, wrapping something around my shoulders, her voice telling me I was going to be okay. I didn't know her name. No one would tell me. For years, I asked. For years, I was told to forget it." He looked down at the paper in his hand, unfolded it, and held it with a care that told me it wasn't just a speech, it was something living. I only learned the truth recently, by accident, through a leaked document I was never supposed to see, and when I read her name, I knew I couldn't stay silent. He glanced at me then, and for the first time our eyes met. "I'm alive today because she disobeyed," he said simply. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, disbelief, awe, something shifting under the surface. "I became a doctor," he went on. "I work in a children's hospital in New York City. I've saved lives because someone once saved mine, and I am not the only one. My younger sister, one of the 43 rescued that night, wrote this before she passed away last year." His voice caught for a fraction of a second, but he steadied it. She wanted to say something if she ever learned who had saved her. He unfolded a small creased note, and when he read, his voice softened until it was almost a whisper. "To the lady with the strong arms, thank you for being brave when the world wasn't. Thank you for choosing us even when you were told not to. I don't remember your face, but I remember feeling safe. That was enough." Something inside me broke in that moment, not in the way things shatter and disappear, but in the way something locked tight finally gives way and lets in air. I didn't cry, but the edges of the world seemed sharper, the colors more saturated, as if memory and present had fused. Behind me, I heard someone sob quietly. Near the front, my father's hands clenched the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. My brother stood frozen, eyes flicking between me and Aaron like he was seeing a ghost. Aaron lowered the note, folded it carefully, and slipped it back into his pocket. "History tried to forget her," he said, "but I won't. We won't." Then he stepped down from the makeshift stage and walked toward me. The crowd shifted, making space for him the way water parts for a swimmer. When he reached me, he extended his hand. "I've waited my whole life to say this," he said. "Thank you, General Carter." I took his hand, firm but not crushing, and for a moment we just stood there, the noise of the world falling away. Sometimes words aren't needed. Sometimes survival speaks for itself. And in that moment, with 200 soldiers still standing in silent salute and a crowd full of people who had spent years pretending I didn't exist, the truth wasn't just out, it was undeniable. For 15 years, my father had managed to keep his eyes anywhere but on me. He'd perfected it, sliding his gaze just past my shoulder at family gatherings, finding an urgent reason to refill his coffee if I spoke, making his attention a currency I no longer had the right to spend. But after Aaron's words, after the crowd turned from him to me, after the air thickened with a truth that could no longer be smothered, he looked at me. It wasn't quick. He didn't jerk his head or blink in surprise. It was slower than that, heavier, like a man turning a page he had sworn never to read again. His eyes locked on mine across the green. 15 years collapsed into a single, unguarded second. I saw the pride he'd buried under discipline. I saw the doubt he'd never dared to voice because questioning the system meant questioning himself. And I saw the pain, the deep, aching kind that comes from realizing you'd been wrong. And not just in private, but in front of the world you'd built your life around. He didn't move at first. My brother leaned toward him, whispered something I couldn't catch, his voice a thread pulled tight. My father didn't answer. His gaze stayed on me like a weight, like an anchor, like the acknowledgement I'd stopped hoping for years ago. Then, without warning, he stood. The crowd seemed to notice before I did, the sound of shifting chairs and murmured confusion rippling through the air. He didn't rush toward me. He didn't even walk in a straight line. He stepped forward until there was nothing between us but a few feet of open ground and an ocean of unsaid things. We stood there, eyes locked, the silence between us louder than any speech. Then he did something I'd only ever seen him do in uniform, and never for me. He nodded, once, sharp, deliberate. Not a public apology, not forgiveness, but recognition. It was the smallest of gestures, and yet it hit me harder than any medal ever could. Behind him, my brother shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between us. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. For the first time, I noticed the absence of his usual smug composure. He looked unsure, and in that uncertainty, there was a glimmer of something I hadn't seen since we were kids: shame. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some people clapped hesitantly, unsure if they were breaking some unspoken rule. Others just stared, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief, admiration, and quiet reckoning. Phones were still up, recording every second. By tomorrow morning, the footage would be everywhere. General Rhodes stepped back into frame, his voice carrying across the field. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed today is the difference between following orders and following what's right. We are here because one woman chose the latter, and 43 lives were saved because of it. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then building into something full, something undeniable. Even those who had whispered about my disgrace joined in, because there's only so long you can cling to a lie when the truth is staring you in the face. My father finally looked away, turning back toward his seat but not sitting down. He stood there, hands gripping the back of his chair, like a man holding onto something that might otherwise collapse. My brother, though, he kept his eyes on me, and for the first time in years I didn't look away. I let him see me, not as the ghost he'd allowed the family to believe in, but as the woman who had stood when it mattered. His mouth opened like he was going to speak, but he closed it again. The words either too heavy or too costly. I could live with that. Around us, the applause kept going, rolling over the green in waves. But inside me, there was no swelling soundtrack, no cinematic crescendo. There was just a quiet shift, a loosening of something that had been locked tight for too long. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as Colonel Carter, not as the disgrace, just as Evelyn, and that was enough. Silence used to feel like punishment. After the green, it felt like permission. The next morning, the farm sounded exactly the same. Screen door hinge, gravel under boots, goats grumbling for grain, except the air was lighter, as if some invisible load had finally been set down. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't chase headlines. Still, the world found me in the ways it always does now. A ping on my phone, a flood of messages from names I hadn't seen in years, a voicemail from a reporter who swore she wanted to get it right this time. I let them stack like unwashed dishes. I made coffee. On the porch, the steam curled into the cool, and I did what I've done every hard morning since Aleppo. I counted what's real, wood grain under my palm, sun pulling the hill out of shadow. The nick on my chipped mug where my thumb fits like it was carved for me. Real things, things no board or brief can edit. By afternoon, the mail truck rumbled up the road, braked with a soft sigh, and left a small stack in my box. One envelope sat on top, unmarked, the paper plain. The edges worn as if it had been handled too many times before someone finally let it go. Inside, a single line in a hand I knew like my own. If you'll allow it, I would like to come by, not to say sorry, to listen. I didn't need a signature. My father's writing always looked like he was laying track. There was a time I would have rehearsed for a day like that. Bullet points, counterpoints, the exact phrasing that could pin a lifetime of injury to the mat and make it tap out. Instead, I set a second chair on the porch, not opposite mine, beside it. I placed another mug on the armrest and left the door open. Then I went about the small business of ordinary life, pulling weeds, mending a fence post, letting my hands remember how to fix things without breaking them first. He came at dusk. The hour light goes soft and honest. The shape of him was the same as always, square shoulders, careful stride, the kind of posture that kept half his heart hidden behind his back. He stopped at the foot of the steps and took off his cap the way he'd taught us to do, crossing a threshold. For a heartbeat, the old instinct rose in me, to brace, to fortify, to protect the softest parts with a harder tone. I let it pass. He climbed the steps and sat without ceremony. We watched the line of the trees go dark against a sky turning lavender. When he spoke, his voice wasn't smaller, just less armored. "I didn't know," he said. And when I didn't know, I told myself I did. I let the words sit there between us like a third presence. He cleared his throat. "I taught you to hold the line," he said. "I never asked what it cost you to be the line." The old anger flickered, brief, hot, reflexive, then died out for lack of kindling. "You taught me to honor the chain," I said. "I learned to honor the people trapped inside it." He nodded once, the way he had on the green, a gesture with more weight than a speech. His hands opened and closed on his knees like he wanted to lift something and didn't know where to grip it. "You were right," he said, and the words landed with the quiet power of a flag lowered in the evening. No fanfare, just truth acknowledged. "I don't expect you to forgive me for the years I chose the story over my daughter." I thought about forgiveness, how people talk about it like a switch you throw, a light that erases the dark. In my world, forgiveness is more like weather, unpredictable, ordinary, showing up in small mercies, a nod on a lawn, a seat on a porch, a space left open where anger once lived. "I don't need you to say sorry," I said. "I need you to remember." We sat like that a long time, not repairing everything, not tearing anything else down. He told me about his morning after the green, the phone calls from old friends, the stubborn itch of pride and shame battling in his chest, the way Aaron's voice had threaded through his certainties and pulled. I told him about the letter that unlocked 45 minutes and the years that taught me how to live when no one wanted proof that I had. When he finally rose, he laid his palm on the rail like a man blessing an altar. "I'll come again," he said. "You can," I answered. He nodded, as permission received, not owed, and walked back into the blue hour, a little smaller and a lot more human. 2 days later, my brother's name lit up my phone. I let it ring to voicemail and listened with my thumb over the delete icon, expecting the old theatre. What I heard instead was breath, then a sentence that started without preamble or polish. "I used your silence to make myself louder," he said. "I told myself it was ambition. It was cowardice. I don't know how to fix 15 years. I do know I don't want to add a 16th. I saved the message. I didn't call back. Not yet. People think reconciliation is a reunion. Sometimes it's a staggered processional. First the truth, then the ones who try to outrun it. First the nod, then the door that creaks open. First the listening, then whatever words can be trusted to carry weight. As for the world beyond our porch, it did what the world does. One clip went viral, then 3, then the speech in full. I didn't watch myself cross the green. I didn't need the echo when I still had the sound. A wave of debates crashed. Obedience versus conscience, code versus care. I didn't enter the ring. People wrote to me anyway. A veteran who said, "I chose the chain once and lost a friend." A mother who wrote, "My son is alive," because a nurse broke protocol to break a rule that would have broken him. A young officer who asked, "How do I know when to move?" I wrote back to the young ones when I could. I told them what I'd learned in unglamorous rooms and dust-bright alleys, that orders are scaffolding, not shelter, that the oath you make is to the people the order touches, that courage without humility is just noise, that you will make mistakes, and the only unforgivable one is choosing safety over someone else's survival because you are afraid to be talked about. Aaron sent a photo from his hospital in Queens, 3 kids with gap-toothed smiles holding hand-drawn signs that read, "Thank you, General," in a dozen shaky colors. He added a line. We hung the note in our break room, the one about the lady with the strong arms. I read it when a night shift gets too long. I printed it and taped it to my fridge between a grocery list and a worn Polaroid of the goats covered in burrs. Doesn't matter where gratitude lives, on a wall in a city, on a cheap wired appliance humming in a quiet kitchen. Either way, it changes the room. Weeks turned into a kind of peace I hadn't trusted before. I fixed what was mine to fix. I let what wasn't be. When interviews offered money for a memoir, I said no. When a documentary team promised control over the edit, I said no again. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing not to perform. There's a difference. On a Sunday, a car I didn't recognize turned up the drive and stalled at the elm. A man stepped out, a little older than the kid whose hand had crushed mine in a basement, while rounds stitched the walls above us. He held the doctor's posture now, upright, weary, tuned to alarms only he could hear. He didn't carry a speech, just a small bouquet he'd picked up at a roadside stand, stems still wet. "Thought you could use some color on the porch," he said. We sat, talked about nothing, the price of diesel, the stubbornness of tomatoes and everything, grief and graft, the scrape of starting over, how sometimes the only applause you'll get is a steady pair of lungs doing what they're supposed to because you once chose to move. When he left, He took nothing but the quiet with him and left more of it behind. If you're waiting for a perfect ending, the kind where every wrong gets a right-sized answer, I can't give you that. What I can give you is what's truer. A father who visits and listens more than he speaks, a brother who shows up one day with a toolbox and fixes the hinge that's stuck for years without being asked, a family wall that doesn't replace the eagle but hangs my photograph beside it. Same frame, same place, different story now, because the image is no longer a substitute for the person it tried to erase. I used to think redemption arrived with trumpets. It doesn't. It arrives with second chairs set out at dawn, with letters that say, I'll listen, with hands that have done harm, folding into admission, without the theatre of absolution. It arrives quietly, like morning, again and again, whether or not you deserve it. If you're listening to this alone in a kitchen where the linoleum curls at the edges, or in a car outside a house you're not sure you'll walk into, or under a streetlight that makes even concrete look gentle, I want to leave you with the only lesson that survived every room I've stood in. You don't need to be recognized to matter. You need to be ready to move when the truth demands it, ready to stand when standing costs you the invitation, the promotion, the photo on the wall, ready to leave a seat open for the person who might come back changed, even if they never do. People ask me if I'd do it again, if I'd trade rank for 43 names I'll never be allowed to say. The answer hasn't changed since the basement. Between a medal and a life, I choose the life. Between a spotless record and a child's breath, I choose the breath. Between the comfort of being believed and the discomfort of being right alone, I choose the discomfort and sit with it until it becomes a kind of peace. The goats are loud as I finish this. The sky is turning. I pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit. The second one might go cold. That's all right. It's there in case someone arrives who needs it. It's there to remind me that absence isn't the same as emptiness, that leaving room is its own kind of courage. If the world wants a tidy epilogue, it can write one. I've got fences to mend and a chair to dust off. The rest, the noise, the praise, the doubt, can do what it wants. I'll be here, listening to the quiet hum of a truth that doesn't need applause to be true.